Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into this week's edition of my top starts and sits for week 5 of this football season. This is the first week we are dealing with buys, so do make sure you have your lineups tinkered before the weekend, just in case you get busy and you forget to set your lineups with guys that are on buys that are currently in your starting lineup. And before I dive in this video, as always, guys, you're going to get my top starts and sits at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position. And I always like to remind people these top starts and sits, I also like to, for me personally, maybe you can do this as well. I factor these into my daily lineups that I do on, I mainly do it on FanDuel, but you can do these on DraftKings. And then I also factor these into my prop bets on Underdog or whatever betting platform that you do. You can use these names to be either betting on the over or betting on the under for some of the players that are in the sit section. So with that being said, starting with the quarterback spot, as I always do, my top start of the week, I am going with Jordan Love against the Rams. Rams have allowed the fourth most fantasy football points per game to the quarterback position through the first 4 weeks of the season. Then when you look into the what they have allowed so far this year, 3 out of the 4 quarterbacks they have faced have reached at least 215 passing yards, and they've given up 8 passing touchdowns and only picked off the quarterback once. So they're giving up 2 touchdowns a game to quarterbacks this year. So I definitely expect a boom ceiling performance out of Jordan Love this weekend. My other start, I am going to go with Caleb Williams against the Panthers. Panthers are tied for the 9th most allowed points per game to the quarterback position this year. As far as their first 4 games, they have allowed 3 out of their 4 quarterbacks they've faced to reach at least 200 passing yards, which, I was like, man, this doesn't seem a lot, the 200 and the 215, but then you factor in the passing numbers are down, so you have to also factor that in, and that's actually kind of a high number, surprisingly, for this season. And then what I really like about Caleb this week is he's facing a defense that's allowed 9 passing touchdowns. They've picked off the quarterback 3 times so far this year. But yeah, they are giving up just over 2 touchdowns a game to quarterbacks this year. So I like for Caleb to actually come through for you this week. My top sits, even though he's been on fire this year and he does have a revenge game, I would consider sitting Sam Darnold. Now, if you do have to play him because your quarterback's on a bye, or maybe you're dealing with quarterback injuries, both these names actually, Sam Darnold and C.J. Stroud, there's more of a temper your expectation play for seasonal leagues. But your daily lineups, these are 2 names I would look to avoid. But starting with Sam Darnold against the Jets have allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position this year. Only 1 quarterback has thrown over 200 passing yards against the Jets, and that was Brock Purdy way back in week 1. And they've only given up 2 passing touchdowns this year, and they've picked off a quarterback once through the first 4 games. So as much as you want to factor in the revenge game factor, the Jets have really not allowed a lot of production to quarterbacks so far this year. My next sit, CJ Stroud against the Bills. Now, I do understand CJ Stroud was a top pick, so in seasonal leagues, you're probably going to leave him in your lineup. So I would just temper your expectations that CJ may just have a floor game this week. But if you're putting together your daily lineups or you're thinking about betting the over on him, maybe I would not consider doing that. With that being said, when you look at this matchup against the Bills have allowed the 9th fewest points per game to the quarterback position this year. Only 1 team has thrown over 200 passing yards against the Bills defense. That was the Dolphins. It was a combination. That was the game that Tua got hurt, so it was a combination between Tua and Skylar Thompson combined for over 200 passing yards against their defense. And honestly, they were throwing the ball a lot too because they were down a lot in that game. They've given up 5 passing touchdowns to 4 interceptions through the first 4 weeks. And I also think too, as much as you like this matchup, I think the quarterbacks just aren't producing a lot against the Bills because you could run the ball against the Bills defense. So I would expect the Texans to try to lean into the run. We'll have to see if Joe Mixon is back this week. If he's not back, maybe they try to work the passing game with CJ Stroud. But again, seasonal leagues, you're going to play him. I understand. I would just temper your expectations. But when you do those daily lineups or prop bets, I would definitely understand. I would definitely suggest not putting him in your daily lineups or betting the over on his production. this week. Moving into the running back position, my top start of the week, I am going to go with Najee Harris against the Cowboys. It came out today that Jalen Warren and Cordell Patterson have not practiced, so I like Najee because he should be dominating the touches, so I'm going to bet on his volume this week. And then he also has a great matchup of going against the Cowboys defense, who have allowed the third most fantasy football points per game to the running back position. Two different running backs so far have finished over 100 total yards against their defense, and they've allowed 7 touchdowns to running backs through the first 4 games, so almost 2 touchdowns a game to running backs so far. So I would expect that Najee can get close to that 100 total yards and get you at least a touchdown on that Sunday night matchup. Now, my next top starts, I'm going with Ramondre Stevenson and Antonio Gibson against the Dolphins. There's a kind of a little scare with Stevenson, right? Gerard Mayo said he may consider starting Gibson over Stevenson because of Stevenson's fumble issues. But I still think he's definitely playable based on this matchup. I mean, it paid off last week. One of my top starts was Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears. Both of them found the end zone, and both of them were productive last week against this Dolphins defense. They both draw a great matchup. Going against Miami, who's allowing the 5th most fantasy football points per game to the running back position this season. 3 different running backs against Miami have finished over 90 total yards in the first 4 games, and they have allowed 8 touchdowns to running backs. So they've given up 2 touchdowns a game to the running back position. So I like to start either of them. And I definitely like Antonio Gibson in the daily lineups because he'll be a cheaper option than Stevenson if you wanted to roll the dice on the daily lineups on Gibson. My top sit of the week, I am going to go with Alvin Kamara against the Chiefs. Now, seasonal leagues, I get it. You're probably going to have to play him. There's buys. There's injuries at the running back position. So in seasonal leagues, I would just temper your expectations that Kamara may just have a floor outcome this week. But as far as daily lineups, that would be a name I would look to avoid. Going against the Chiefs defense, who have allowed the 2nd fewest points per game to the running back position so far this year. Not one single running back has ran over 50 rushing yards against the Kansas City defense, and they've only given up 2 touchdowns to running backs this year. So it definitely feels like this is a touchdown or bust matchup for Kamara if you want to play him inside your lineups this week. My other top sits, I am going to go with Zach Moss and Chase Brown against the Ravens defense. The Ravens are giving up the 4th fewest points per game against the running back position so far this year. And then just like the Chiefs defense, not one single running back has ran over 50 rushing yards against their defense. And then you're talking about a touch backfield. So you're kind of just hoping if you do play them, one of them is going to get a touchdown. Speaking of touchdowns, they've only allowed 3 touchdowns to the running back position through the first 4 games. So yeah, those would be 2 names I would be looking to avoid if you can this week, because again, I do understand there are bye weeks, there are injuries, so if you have to play these guys in your seasonal leagues, temper your expectations. You're probably going to get a floor outcome, but as far as daily lineups, I would look to avoid having them in daily lineups this weekend. Moving into the wide receiver position, my top start of the week, I am going to go with Amari Cooper against the Commanders defense. The Commanders have allowed the most points per game to the wide receiver position so far this year. They've allowed 3 different wide receivers to finish over 75 receiving yards in the first 4 games. And then what I really like about Amari is that I'm going to bet that he's going to find a way to get into the end zone this weekend, because the Commanders have allowed 10 receiving touchdowns to the wide receiver position. So that is, that's over 3 touchdowns a game, or not 3. My math's terrible right there. About 2.5 touchdowns a game to the wide receiver position through the first 4 weeks. So that's why I definitely would hammer in Amari Cooper, and then I'm also maybe going to consider an anytime touchdown bet on Amari this weekend. My other top starts, I kind of hinted at this last night when I did my waiver wire pickup with Dontavian Wicks, but I like the Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, or even Romeo Doubs against the Rams defense. Rams have allowed the 6th most fantasy football points per game to the wide receiver position. They have actually allowed 3 different wide receivers to go over 100 receiving yards against their defense, and they have given up 7 receiving touchdowns to wide receivers so far this year. So just almost 2 touchdowns a game to wide receivers. Jaden, I like all of them. If you want to stream a Dobbs or a Wicks, if you picked them off the waivers because your wide receiver position's banged up or they're dealing with buys, I would definitely consider that. And then in the fantasy daily lineups, I definitely like maybe Romeo Doubs, because I feel like he'll probably be the cheapest option out of the 3 to put into your daily lineups this weekend. My sits, now, I left him on here. I didn't know if I should have like just took him off or leave him on, but I figured I should just tell you guys to sit him, even though he probably is not even going to suit up in this game. But Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers against the Broncos defense. If you guys are, for whatever reason, unaware right now, Devontae Adams has requested a trade from Las Vegas, so I totally don't expect him to be in pads this weekend. Now, for whatever reason, if he does play, I would still look to avoid him just because how much is he going to play? Is he going to give a full effort considering he just requested a trade? And then as far as Jacoby Myers, you might be thinking, oh, Devontae's not going to play. Myers is going to get all the targets. So if you do play Myers, you're basically going to bet that somehow the volume of targets will turn into production. But that might not happen because he's going against this Broncos defense who's allowed the third fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. There is the Patrick Surtain effect. Patrick Surtain has basically shut down the opposing team's number one receiving option in every single game this year. So if Devontae Adams, which like I said, I do expect Adams is not going to suit up this weekend for Las Vegas. So you're talking about Patrick Surtain is probably going to cover Jacoby Myers for the most of that game and probably end up shutting him down. And then some other factors why I would look to avoid Jacoby Myers is only one wide receiver has finished over 75 receiving yards against the Denver defense, and that was Tyler Lockett. And by the way, that means Surtain was going against DK Metcalf and shut him down in that matchup. I believe that was in week 1. And then they have only given up one receiving touchdown to a wide receiver in the first 4 games. So this is a touchdown or bust matchup if you decide to put Myers in your lineups this weekend. My other one, I'm going to go with Deontay Johnson against the Bears. The Bears have allowed the 7th fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. Now, they have allowed 2 different wide receivers to finish over 75 receiving yards. That was Nico Collins and Tutu Atwell. But the reason why I don't like Deontay is just because this Bears defense has been playing really good football over the last couple weeks, and I think they're going to key on taking away Deontay from Andy Dalton and make the other wide receivers like Xavier Legette beat them in the passing attack. And then also, too, they've also have only given up one receiving touchdown to wide receivers in the first 4 games. So I do feel like if the volume of targets do not pay off for Deontay Johnson as far as the PPR leagues, you're going to hope that he happens to find the end zone in a tough matchup this week. Moving into the lovely tight end position, which is basically a dart throw. We already all know this position stinks every single year as far as finding the guy that you can start every single week and trust it. But there might be an option for people where you can stream a tight end against the Chiefs, assuming they're not one of the upper echelon tight ends that they're not going to be dropped or out there on the waivers. So if you want to take a chance on this, I would consider it. Juwan Johnson against the Kansas City Chiefs on Monday night. The Chiefs have allowed the most points per game to the tight end position. They're the only team in the NFL right now that is giving up double-digit fantasy football points per game. Now, through the first 4 weeks, they've given up 365 receiving yards to tight ends. And then also, 3 different tight ends have finished with at least 55 receiving yards against their defense. As I've always said about the tight end position, just give me 5 points. So 3 different tight ends have at least reached 5+ points against the Kansas City defense. So if you wanted to roll the dice on Juwan Johnson, I think it's definitely worth the risk this week. Another one that you can consider streaming, I am going to go with Mike Gesicki against the Ravens defense. The Ravens have allowed they're tied for the 4th most allowed points per game to the tight end position. They have allowed the 2nd most receiving yards against tight ends in the first 4 games. And then they have allowed at least 3 different tight ends to finish with at least 45 receiving yards. So if you are in a half point or PPR league, that is getting you to 5 points at least 3 times this season against the Ravens defense. And Gesicki has performed before in the past in good streaming options. Good streaming weeks. So I would definitely consider streaming him as well in week 5. Then moving into my top sits, I am going to go with Dalton Kincaid against the Texans defense. They have allowed the 4th fewest points per game against tight ends this year. Through the first 4 games, they've only given up 49 receiving yards to tight ends. And then as far as a single tight end performance, it was Cole Kmet who had the best game against the Texans defense. He finished with 27 receiving yards. So yeah, even though he's been more involved over the last couple weeks, this might not be a matchup you want to play him. I understand it too. I have him in a league. I'm just gonna believe him. Like with the tight end position, if you have one of those guys or at least getting the targets, you kind of just gotta leave them in your lineup and just hope for the best. That's what I'm going to do, but I'm also going to temper my expectations and understand that Kincaid probably is going to have a floor outcome this weekend. Speaking of another floor outcome this week that you might want to just look to avoid if you can, maybe go pick up a Jawan Johnson and stream. I would look to sit or leave it again. Dalton Kincaid and these two tight ends. As far as daily lineups, I would look to avoid having these guys in daily lineups. But Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews against the Bengals defense. The Bengals have allowed the 6th fewest points per game against tight ends this year. They've given up 115 receiving yards to tight ends through the first 4 weeks, and then the best performance by a single tight end was Zach Ertz last week, the previous week, where they gave up 38 receiving yards to him. So that's the best one that I came across over the first 4 games. I just, I have Mark Andrews in the league. I'm gonna leave him on the bench. But I feel like it doesn't not. I'm just gonna go ahead and say this. I still think you should sit him, but doesn't it feel like the week that everybody's going to bench Mark Andrews is going to be the week he finally comes through and he's going to be on majority of people's fantasy football benches? I feel like that deep down in my heart, but the matchup says leave him out of your lineup, especially with how the lack of production that we've seen from him thus far. So yeah, those are my top starts and sits for week 5. As always, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. Please make sure you follow and subscribe to me on all my social media platforms. I'm on X, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. And then other than that, guys, I hope you enjoy your night, your evening, your morning, whenever you're watching this. I'll talk to you guys next Tuesday for the top waiver wire targets and streamable defenses. Wish you the best of luck. I hope you come out this weekend with a W, or W's, because I assume you're like me in multiple leagues. Peace out.